So I'm gonna give you a number.
We'd blindfold and then show her mother a random number generator, a random picture generator.
The kid will say, "I'm reading your mind." And then they do a few little experiments.
We did various tests, and she was right every time.
Their kids can see things that they simply can't.
Her answer is 100% accurate.
What is the second number?
6!
Oh my God!
We think of as woo-woo or this airy-fairy stuff, but it's true.
Autistic individuals have these incredible abilities.
The science behind this is so much bigger than our knee-jerk reactions of truth.
We have everyone on the crew just come and write a word down, okay?
E.
H.
Ha.
A.
Ha. Fa. Fa. Fa.
L. O. W.
You've just done an amazing job of documenting these autistic, in many cases nonverbal children who display telepathic powers, which I can't believe I'm even saying, but you show that this is, occurring in statistically significant ways.
And then what picture am I looking at now? Okay. That's you. Say it.
Son. Akhil, what is this?
Osha. Ha. Osaria.
You see, I'm not even looking at him.
Yeah.
You have a Harvard-trained neuroscientist, Dr. Diane Powell, who's doing the studies, but you also, seem eminently, normal and not, insanely woo-woo.
I needed to believe it was happening. And so I asked Diane, can I do my own test where I bring the cues and pick the house? I didn't want her to be a factor in it, so I wanted to control the test.
I don't want Dr. Powell to bring this stuff. I don't want families to bring this stuff. I just want to be like the layer for the skeptics where it's like, get this on Amazon. I'm not even going to open it until the day up.
And she said yes, and I said, I'd like it to be a family we haven't tested yet, that you've never met. I just wanted to clear out any of the possible factors that could influence this. That's kind of how it began. We brought this young girl, Mia, up from Mexico. Most of the family didn't even speak English. Only her Aunt Sophia did. And I rented a house in Glendale, California. And we took all the mirrors down and all the TVs down and put up cameras every which way and started the process of testing her. And with a divider that would go between her and her mother, we'd blindfold Mia and then show her mother a random number generator, a random picture generator. I brought flashcards, colored balls. We did various tests. And she was right every time.
Hay un personaje en la página 26. Pu. I. R. A.
The tests were remarkable. I mean, just hearing her say without fail what's in her mother's mind, it's just, I don't know, it's so amazing. And then hearing the earnestness of her parents as well, where it's like, these people clearly are not lying. They're not grifting, there's no ulterior motive here.
You
can write a word too. You can write a word.
So Akhil just sees the back of my hand. Okay, I'm just going to grab one. Actually, that's too easy. Hold on, that goes with what we just looked at. That's
Tell
a
me
good
when it's ready.
Okay, you see this?
Yeah, what do you want?
Okay,
Akhil, what's in my mind? What's the picture about?
C. R. O. C. O. D. I. L. E. Crocodile.
so awesome, Akhil. That's so awesome.
Ready? And 3. Yeah, and 3.
Good job.
Here we go. You're doing so good. 8 and 5. I think that, with the telepathy tapes, one of the things that I realized in terms of, instead of me just writing up all these cases, and then that being yet another thing that's in the scientific literature, that people need to hear what I hear, because I'm not just collecting data. I'm assessing, the tone of voice, the content of what's said. You really, there's so much information there that's not like, mathematical data, but there's so much information that you're getting from actually listening to these families and listening to the people who see this stuff, for the first time, or listening to their struggles with, how do I make sense of this? Because that's really what I'm the kind of contact I get all the time from these families is, I don't know what to make of this, and they're relieved that their child isn't the only one.
So, I'm a documentary filmmaker by trade, and I've created 5 feature films. But I will tell you, I felt bashful when I started working on something that had to do with telepathy. My dad, I remember saying something along the lines of, like, your hard-earned career and reputation are going to be, scattered to the wind. It felt hard to talk about to people, to clients. I also direct commercials and stuff. And my mother-in-law is, at the time I started making it was, lives on a sheep farm in rural Minnesota. And just all these people were like, oh, has Ky kind of gone off the deep end here? And that's why, to me, it was like, just the word telepathy, you can't reduce it to fact or fiction. Let's go look at the stories of these people, the science behind this. This is so much bigger than our knee-jerk reactions of truth.
I just spoke to Dr. Diane Powell. Mm-hmm. In fact, we've been in touch for like a year and a half or something. And I've always found her just to be this amazing woman. And she's just an impressive combination of extremely open-minded, but also extremely rigorous.
Yeah.
And so how did you get in touch with her? You heard her on a podcast? Is that right?
It unfolded by me hearing her on a podcast about her research that she'd been doing.
Today, I'm here with Diane Powell, and we will be focusing on her research on some autistic savants with telepathic abilities.
And I thought that was fascinating, and I wanted to get on the phone and learn more, and went out to visit her. And, one of the first things I, asked of her was, can you pull up some emails? And obviously not share names, but tell me some of the things that people are saying when they write to you. And that was a very convincing first step for me to witness, is that, this wasn't just something she was talking about or she studied in a few one-offs. Her email box was filled of parents reaching out saying, I'm finding that my child can read my thoughts. It seems impossible. We've tested it at home. I have no framework for this. Can you explain what is happening? And it was a confusion and a wonderment and sometimes a desperation coming from these parents to understand what was going on. And they don't know each other. They are very siloed. And that was the first moment where I thought, okay, there's something very big here.
So how does one go from a traditional academic background to studying autistic children who have high extrasensory perception abilities?
I learned about autism and savants back in 1986 because I met Oliver Sacks then. So Oliver Sacks was a neurologist who wrote a lot of different books. One of the books he wrote was Awakenings, about people that had Parkinson's and were given L-Dopa for the first time. And all of a sudden they went from being like frozen statues to suddenly, moving. And there was a movie made about that. And he was somebody that would study these quirky sort of syndromes that told you something about the brain. One of the case reports were about these twins who were institutionalized, who were autistic, who played a game in which they would say prime numbers back and forth to one another, and they'd be consecutive prime numbers. They would be 6 digits long, and there's no algorithm for that. And they just knew these prime numbers, and not only did they know them, they said they just saw them.
I am thrilled to partner with MyHeritage to dive into my family's past. It's been an eye-opening experience. Using MyHeritage, I started building my family tree by adding names, dates, and even a photo. Within minutes, I was connected to over 20 billion historical records, uncovering stories I had no idea existed. For example, my great-grandfather, Nathan White, was a World War I veteran who got PTSD because of what he experienced on the battlefield. My grandfather, Irving White, conducted groundbreaking research around the JFK-Nixon debates, which made headlines across North America. These discoveries felt deeply personal and connected me to my roots in a way I never imagined. One feature of MyHeritage that I love is called Instant Discoveries, where a whole branch of my family tree was added with just one click. I even found old black and white photos of my family and used MyHeritage's AI tools to colorize and animate them. It was like bringing history to life. Sharing these moments with my family was unforgettable, and I even recorded their reactions. It's been a very meaningful journey.
Dad, what do you think about that?
Wow, that's incredible. I had no idea.
See, the thing is, MyHeritage doesn't just connect you to the past. It makes your history feel alive and relevant today. If you've ever wondered about your origins, I can't recommend MyHeritage enough. Start your 14-day free trial today using the link in the description or pinned comment. Trust me, it's an experience you won't forget.
For so many of these families, they are told by the doctors when their child is born and is diagnosed with, non-speaking, often severe autism, that they won't comprehend the world around them. They'll never be able to communicate. They probably won't process information beyond that of a toddler. And so parents are all hope is taken away. And they go through this journey, often not even trying to reach their child because they've been told by all the quote-unquote experts that their kid isn't in there. And what I found really early on were two families, both Mia and another girl, Amelia, who appears in episode 7, that when the parents were homeschooling with COVID and they had to spend tons of time with their child, all of a sudden their child started spelling on iPads, doing things they weren't ever doing in school.
Yeah.
And that's what happened with Mia. And then when she started communicating, at one point, she started having a diary. And in her diary, she said, I can read my parents' minds.
She wrote in her diary that she can read everybody's mind, but you have to believe in her for her to do it.
Well, they thought, that's impossible. So her mom asked a few questions, like what am I thinking of right now? And, Mia spelled purple umbrella or something. Or her dad drew a picture, and what I draw a picture of, and she wrote dog. And that was correct. So then they started doing more tests and taking books off the wall, opening to a page on the book, a page of the book. And what am I reading? And she would spell it out. What am I looking at in the book? And she'd spell it out. And that's when they started doing blindfolded popsicle tests with her, where they'd have piles and she'd put popsicle sticks. So they took a bunch of videos of this stuff, sent it to Diane, sent it to me to kind of pre-vet it. And it was absolutely unbelievable. And they were as concerned and confused as any parent would be. To the point, they were deeply Catholic. They live in Monterrey, Mexico. And they were worried, what are our neighbors going to feel? Is this evil? Is this, there's all these funny things that get put on telepathy. Not what I've learned through making this is what the non-speakers would say is this is a spiritual gift from God. That is, I think, what every single one would say. And us, humans in this 3D world trying to map it out for so long have been like, this is the work of something dark. And that couldn't be further from the truth.
Agreed. And so she's sending you videos and you say, I want to see this for myself. And so you put them up in a place in Glendale, and you have completely controlled experimental conditions to remove all confounding variables. And so tell me if I'm getting this right. So Mia is, sitting next to her mother, and her mother is looking, and Mia's totally blindfolded, and then her mother is looking at completely random, large assortment of images or numbers. So it'd be extremely low probability if you were to get it right just in one instance. Is that correct?
Yeah.
And if you were to get it right, over 10 or 20 instances, the quote-unquote p-value is what you would call it in science, gets to infinitesimally low.
Yeah.
Is that somewhat right? Or
yeah, and I just want to say something really quick. Dr. Powell wants to do these really scientific airtight tests with Faraday cages and, get this as tight as can be, and we're hoping to do that in the film that has been the intention all along. These tests I was kind of creating, so it was as concrete as I could make it with like the limited finances and stuff. But I would say, yes, I think that anyone there would say that we went through every measure. I bought even a brand new iPad to make sure it couldn't be influenced. I downloaded all the random number generators on set. So we have video of that happening. We took down all, like I said, TV, mirrors, anything reflective. And yeah, like we went through pains to make sure that there was a divider when Mia was shown a number and that she was blindfolded. And then we would take the blindfold off, remove the partition. And as far as the numbers, I think we started off small, like 3 numbers, and then we did 4 numbers, and then we did 5 numbers, and it would generate 52763 or whatever. And then she would write it 52763. And it's like she would never miss, you know? And we did flashcards, some random word generators. We would put colored balls inside of a can or something, and she'd tell us what color it was. We did popsicle stick tests, which was beyond telepathy because no one's sending information then. It's like there's a bunch of popsicle sticks, and her mom would hand her random ones to put in a pile, and she could see them through her blindfold.
A perfect blindfold.
Yeah.
Which you had your skeptical colleague, Michael, test. And he was like, I cannot see anything through this blindfold.
Yeah. And that was important to me. I mean, Michael is a very dear friend, and he's my DP in a lot of my work. But he approached this very skeptically. Yeah. I mean, more so than even, like me. And so I had him test the blindfold, and I mean, Michael certainly had his mind blown. You can't see this stuff and not have your worldview change forever.
What are your thoughts? I mean, I wouldn't do it as a skeptic. I'm generally a skeptic in my life for most things. But through seeing this, I can't, it's hard for me to not believe this is authentic. I'm looking at everything. I'm watching her. I'm watching the mom. I'm watching everything. And for me, in my perspective, it's real.
Michael and any, I think, reasonable listener would say, unless there's some bizarre Morse code that is developed in a way that's extremely high throughput and you can somehow, based on like pokes or something, abstract that out to semantic concepts like, oh, you're looking at a grapefruit on this iPad or something. Yeah. Quickly, the null hypothesis becomes more fantastical than this child is displaying extremely high rates of telepathy.
Yeah. And I think that's important for listeners who haven't listened to the show, your listeners, is that, so kind of where I left off with Mia, so often these parents are told their kids can't learn, which is completely not true. The non-speakers are brilliant individuals inside of there who just cannot control their body. It's a behavior issue, not an intelligence one. So, but learning to spell is meaning learning to control your body. It's a gross motor skill to point to letters, whereas talking is a fine motor skill. And that's why pointing to letters with a letterboard is often a way that unleashes their communication skills. However, because you have to create new neural pathways to do that, often this is really important, a lot of non-speakers don't know where their bodies are. They don't feel them. I've talked to so many parents who said their children didn't even know they had bodies or didn't know they had fingers. And they didn't get that until they started communicating, right? So to help them spell, it often requires touch in the beginning, and then you sort of start to lighten the touch or move the touch until there's no touch. And in the podcast, I use the metaphor of when my dad taught me how to ride a bike. I needed his whole body on me, helping me. And then it was like less body, less touch until finally I was riding the bike. And with Mia, we went out to dinner that night before. Every time we were on Zoom, her mom would have to touch her shoulder or her head to communicate. It was just what she needed. Just the slightest touch helped her. And now her mom is telling me she can do it without it. And that's how most of these kids are. Some will always need touch, but most will graduate to a point where they don't need it once they have more body control, they feel more sense of where they are. So Mia, when she was doing these tests, had to have one slight touch on her, either her shoulder, her head. And the idea that like some Morse code was going through there to someone who can't feel their body is ridiculous. And when I brought that up to Michael, I mean, you could just hear his disdain and his laugh of like, that's impossible. Right. Like, that is grasping at straws.
And he came in pretty skeptical.
He came in very skeptical.
Yeah.
But you can look at the test. It's not like there's something happening in the finger. I mean, how could you ever convey a number or a random, like you said, a abstract word through Morse code on a...
It's impossible, but I think it's a great first example because she's beyond earnest, and then the stats on what she's producing are just remarkable. And then you actually go on to control for that variable as far as touch, which I think is honestly going the extra mile. Again, maybe even unnecessary, but to the extreme skeptic in the audience should satisfy them.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to note, too, that Dr. Powell got into this because she actually saw there was initially some data around autistic children displaying, high clairvoyance or telepathy and studies even prior to her.
Yes. Yeah.
And so there is a body of work.
Yeah.
I mean, psychical studies have been going on since the 1870s, the Society of Psychical Research. You had, Frederick Myers, you had William James.
Yeah.
This is a long history.
Yeah, and there was a man named Bernie Rindland who first kind of came up with this idea that maybe not telepathy, but ESP gifts should be a savant skill, and he was noticing it in the autistic population, the severely autistic, non-speaking population. And so I think Dr. Diane was like, okay, there's something to build off of here. And just again to talk about Diane, when after those tests with Mia, I was, really shaken. And she's like, they don't count Ky in terms of science, in terms of the rigorous science that we need to prove this because she was being touched. So it can never be touched. And it was like, okay, that's unfair. But to these poor children and these poor families, I didn't even want Mia's family to hear that. They were so wanting, just to be part of this validating process. But then the next episode, we go to a young man named Akhil who lives in New Jersey who can do the telepathy with his mom across the room.
Akhil, what is this? You see, I'm not even looking at him.
Yeah.
I'm just going to put it away. And then set him.
No.
Fix it. Focus. Fix it. And then...
You're a genius.
So Akhil is... he's one of the children that I had tested before meeting Ky. And... I met him actually through his mom contacting me after seeing me being interviewed by Deepak Chopra. And she's Indian, and she's like saw Deepak Chopra interview me and said, she's talking about somebody just like my son. And so she contacted me, and I went out and tested her son, and then later invited, Deepak Chopra to come see it. And he was so blown away.
How can you tell what these words and numbers are? Because you're not seeing them directly.
Han.
There.
Mine knows how to show my mom.
Nah.
Han.
Nah.
Ma. I-N-D. My mind knows how to show my mom's mind.
My mind knows how to show my mom's mind. It's quite amazing.
Akhil's mother, Manisha, kept telling me, look, this isn't just telepathy. This is a shared consciousness. There's some sort of merging that goes on. And she was saying things which I couldn't quite understand yet in my process, which was she felt, he often will maybe use my hardware or my neurology. Then I thought, oh, what? Just really wanting to understand. And so she kept showing me when I was doing little tests like, okay, and actually I love this because I had the crew write a bunch of random words, and I downloaded a random number generator on the spot again, random word generator. We did all this stuff with Akhil, and Manisha was kind of like, come on, this is like kid stuff. Like, let me show you really what this is. And so after I was satisfied with, we must have done 100 tests that day. She was like, okay, now you write a word. So I wrote a word, and he'd start saying it verbally. He can kind of communicate through words, or he'd start spelling it. And she'd be like, now cross it out and start writing another one. And in the midst of crossing it out, the second it's crossed out and you start even thinking about the next one, he'd start writing the next one. And that's where she's like, do you see what I mean? I'm not even having time to send him this thought of we crossed out car and now it's, I don't remember what it was, piano or something. The second that the next word was starting to be written, he would know.
One day I was watching a movie of an athlete whose leg was amputated, and he got into Special Olympics. And I went upstairs to tell Akhil, come, look, I want to show you the story. See how people overcome their difficulties and challenges. He said, yes, I know he doesn't have a leg and he is in Olympics.
Because he was watching the show or something.
Because I was watching and he was upstairs. So those thoughts can get transferred.
So she's like, is this a signal of consciousness that we're both sharing? Is he stepping into my own consciousness? Or what is that? And I don't think there is an answer for that yet, except for that is a widespread thing that the parents are talking about.
Yes, you got it.
Spelling and the ability to communicate. A lot of people might be watching this and saying, you keep saying nonverbal. How do they communicate at all?
Yeah. So I think the telepathy and the spiritual gifts, I don't know exactly, but I will say I think it's a mark of being a non-speaker.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it has as much to do with autism as it does non-speaking autism. And with the non-speakers, again, so often the doctors, the educators have had it wrong, thinking they're not in there. They are. They're intellectually as solid as you and me, just can't control their bodies. And because they can't create words, which is a fine motor skill, it's pointing to letters, which is, there's different techniques for that. It started with facilitated communication that merged into, turned into something called rapid prompting method. Now there's spelling to communicate. There's different forms of different processes to learn to point to letters. And you do have to learn to be a communication partner, and that's really important. But I found that the colloquial word for all of it is spelling. That's a good umbrella word to talk about all forms of pointing to letters to communicate.
Yep.
And that can be independently on an iPad or with a letterboard.
And absurdly, there is some controversy around this format of communication. What is ASHA and why do they have anything, bad to say about spelling and RPM and some of these other techniques?
ASHA is the American Speech Language Pathologist. It's the board that gives people accreditation to work with language and speech. And ASHA says that spelling is not a valid form of communication. They've called it pseudoscience. It is the most frustrating thing to these parents and to the non-speakers. I mean, I can't think of a bigger human rights violation than saying you cannot have the means to communicate in your classroom, in a workplace, in a social setting. But when I was doing a deep dive into this is fascinating. That sign language. It took 150 years for that to be accepted.
Is that true?
Even in the 70s, it was not encouraged to have sign language in school. You had the people who were hard of hearing or deaf were told that they had to learn to read lips or have kind of speakers on their ears, hearing aids. Sign language was not accepted.
What?
Louis Braille, who was a young boy who kind of, maybe a preteen when he invented Braille, he was at the first school for the deaf in France at the time. And this was interesting, in France and all over the world at the time. Blind. The blind community was seen as not in there, not smart, all the same thing that non-speakers are going through. So when Louis Braille was at the first school for the blind in France, he kind of enhances this old military kind of coding, and he came up with this idea for Braille. And when a new headmaster came into the school, he was like, this is pseudoscience, this isn't real. He locked away all the Braille books. You can't learn this way. And the kids were like, no, this is really great. And they were doing it, in private. But the authorities didn't want Braille to become a thing. And when the kids first tested, showed the authorities, look, I will punch out these letters and this one will read it. And they kind of proved that Braille is working. People in the room watching that was like, it's a magic trick. It's a joke.
Wow.
They obviously practiced this in advance.
Yeah.
And so I was reading the history of Louis Braille and thinking, this is exactly what the non-speakers are going through. So it makes you wonder why. Why have we always, the reigning, communication class has such strict views and restrictions over how someone else can communicate?
Two.
Yeah.
Good.
Four.
The question that I asked him was, how did you learn all of this? Do you have really good hearing? And he said, I'm special. And I said, oh, of course you're special. And he said, I can hear thoughts. And I said, bullshit. I questioned him and I said, are you sure you're telling the truth? And he said to me, you don't get the kind of gifts that I have if you lie. So then I asked him a question in my head without speaking, and he answered the question that I had asked him in my head. Then I brought my son and his friend up to witness it. And I had told the young man that was his friend, I said, Kit, get a thought in your head and sit there and don't think anything but that. And Houston spelled out what that young man was thinking. Then I called my daughter, and she didn't believe me. She said, no, he can't, Mom. I said, like, send me something. So she had her husband tell her something to text. She texted it to me. He never saw the text, and he spelled out what was on the text.
I think the Houston story is incredibly powerful because it's so much later in life. His mother she's amazing. Yeah. And finds RPM when he's 21 or so, or what's the exact story there?
Yeah. So, Katie was a single mom of 5,
Mm-hmm.
No help from her ex-husband, a pretty brutal guy. And I can't tell you how beautiful of a human being Katie is, but fighting against the world at every turn. It was really difficult because Houston had the way his autism was expressing himself. I mean, he was biting through his hands like down to the muscle at times. He was smearing feces on the wall, and Katie could not get through to him, didn't know how to help him. And it was years of just a lot of hardship and trauma. And she's working full time and not getting child support. And it was through, I think, what she would definitely describe as a series of miracles of people putting spelling in her path. And she initially thought, well, you don't know because Houston's probably much more different than your child. I'm watching your child sit here calmly and spelling, and Houston, he's a different level of autism. Well, that's not true at all. I think she pretty much had given up hope on Houston.
It took me a very long time to give up hope. A part of me breaks inside to give up.
She tried everything. Nothing was getting through to him. And I think it was the day before Thanksgiving when Houston was about 18. Katie had come home from working like multiple jobs, like shaking. She was so tired on the sofa. And Houston came and sat down and put his hand on her.
And he said, Mama. And I was shocked because I had never, ever heard my son say my name. He was 17. And I opened my eyes and he was looking directly into my eyes, which he had also never done. And he said, I love you.
And that moment for her was a miracle. And she's like, wait, he's telling me something. He is in there, or he's knowing how I'm feeling. And so then there was a few examples of spelling that came into her path, and then eventually she decided to try it. Houston, at first when you're learning to spell, it doesn't come quickly. Like often you're pointing to like a board that has 6 letters, so it's bigger and more spaced out. And then maybe you're answering a question. Is it this or is it that? And they call it getting open on the boards when you first start communicating your own thoughts. And for Houston, I believe that happened when he was about 21. And then it was amazing because she learned he has rich knowledge of American history. He loves American history, rich knowledge of so much. And I mean, Houston's knowledge is phenomenal. And what I've learned from Katie and Houston's story has been paradigm shifting throughout. But, even just little things, like I never understood why people thought like crystals and rocks had magic in them. To me, I was like, this is a cute thing we do as humans. And I couldn't dismiss it, but I just didn't get it. I didn't believe that. And Katie certainly did not either. And then one day after like a, massage or something, Katie brought home a bunch of like a bag of rocks and crystals. They were behind like her bedroom door, her bathroom door. And Houston comes home and like knocks through all doors and finds the rocks and crystals.
Houston started shouting, stones, stones, stones. And he wouldn't stop. And so I just was like, here, take them. I mean, I didn't know what to do with them. So anyway, I went into his room a little bit later, and he had lined these 3 stones up on his bedside table on the very edge, and he was lying on the very edge of his bed as close as he could get to these stones.
He felt all the energy coming from them, and he could name which each one was and felt the frequency of each.
And he started spelling, when you're autistic, you're a magnet for all energy, good and bad. These stones have good energy. I need more good energy.
And, Katie has other stories of coming home and buying like crystals for I think it was her son-in-law, hiding like dice for Dungeons and Dragons or something. And like Houston like came home from school and found those because he could like hear them or feel them, energy. And stuff like that made me realize, okay, so if I dismissed telepathy and that's real, and I dismissed the power of crystals and that's real, what else have we dismissed that we think of as woo-woo or, this airy-fairy stuff? And it is true.
I want to stick with Houston, who's so remarkable. So he lives in Atlanta, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there's kind of a cohort in Atlanta. Do you want to talk about Houston's friends and where they hang out?
Yeah. And I want to say, I think these cohorts are everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
It was just, through Katie and Houston, I was led into this Atlanta cohort, but there's cohorts everywhere. So but one of the most beautiful, unbelievable things, first it started with Akhil, and that's apparent in episode 2, where he said every non-speaker has this gift. And I kind of thought, wow, well, that's quite a statement, but then I went to go meet Katie in Houston, and that's in episode 3. And Houston repeats that every non-speaker has this gift, and revealed that and Houston's the one that coined this term, the talk on the Hill, which was this telepathic chat room where non-speakers can tune in and communicate with each other. And that was hard to believe. And then, Katie's like, well, you need to meet my dear friend Libby and her son John Paul. John Paul goes on the Hill, and we went to their house, and John Paul went on the Hill, and it was really cool. He went into his room and he put a bunch of pillows on his head. And Libby, who's just like such a dear, again, like beautiful human being, was just like, this is what he does. After school, he'll do this. And he says he's on the Hill. And I've learned about now that he's communicating with the letterboard, and he's really formed relationships there. And she's like, in fact, there was a young man, his name is Zahari, and he was born blind in an orphanage and was adopted, later in life and whatever. But just Zahari's mom was bringing Zahari to Georgia. He'd never met John Paul, but when Zahari walked into the house, he's like, hey, John Paul, blah, blah. They had this whole relationship, and they said it had been built on the Hill. Wow. And so, and I say this in the series, it took me a long time to form my opinion or understanding of the Hill. And I don't want to say a belief in it, but maybe it was a belief in it. It was just so hard to believe, And then there's so many people from disparate places talking about the Hill. One was a minister I met at a megachurch. I didn't meet him in person, but I talked to him on the phone, and his name is Joe. And he was saying that some of his kids in his youth group were talking about the Hill. He runs like a special needs youth group. And would talk, they'd set them up with like other non-speakers in other places, and the kids would talk about the Hill. And then I met a teacher in Chicago, and her kids were talking about the Hill. And it's just phenomenal. And then Arthur Golden, who's a dear advisor and has been such a help on this whole project as well. And he's got a non-speaking son, Ben Golden, and they live in a very ultra-Orthodox community in Israel. They have their own Hill.
Wow.
And I've heard of hills in Arizona, Florida. So I don't think there's just one.
Yeah.
And that's one thing I want to understand. And I will seek that question with the non-speaker advisory board and further in the film. Is the Hill just this part of this collective consciousness where we can all hang out? Is it like a separate place that you can go to share ideas? How many hills are there? Or is it just all one hill, but you just find each other? Like if you go to a party, you're at different parts of the room, but you're in the same place?
Have you and Dr. Powell done any tests when it comes to information transmission remotely on this kind of Hill?
That's what we want to do. So we're kind of coming up with our list of dream tests for the film project, and her storyline in the film. I want to culminate with these tests, right? And one will be the telepathic, message sending in a controlled way behind partitions and with blindfolds, and the other would be having 2 or 3 non-speakers in different locations to communicate together via the Hill and try to validate what each is coming back with and saying.
What you just said about Houston kind of just reminded me of this amazing story that you tell of Josiah. Do you want to tell this story?
Oh, yeah.
Josiah and Max Davis?
Yeah, that's incredible. And he's got a book, Josiah's Fire, so that's another really good one. But Max Davis is an author, and Josiah's mom started working on a book. So this is just pocket Max Davis for a second. So Josiah's mom, when Josiah started spelling, was absolutely floored by the amount of spiritual messages he was saying.
His first ever independent sentence was the most mind-blowing, miraculous thing because he had not spelled anything beyond 3 to 5 letter words.
So what was his first sentence?
God is a good gift giver.
He was saying that, he was communicating with angels. He said he was going to heaven.
How do you know that? And he spells A-U, and I'm thinking he's going to spell autism or something. He goes on to spell A-U-N-T-I-E. Auntie told an angel to tell me. Auntie was my great aunt, and she died at age 89. Josiah, as far as I know, had never heard us talk of Auntie. He wouldn't have known Auntie. He wouldn't have seen pictures of Auntie. How did he know Auntie?
He knew things about a past relative, Auntie, that, and was communicating for Auntie. And this was just unbelievable. And when
they had never told them about Auntie, right?
No.
Yeah.
No. So again, it was just unbelievable messages that there's no way Josiah should know. And I think at the time he was 7 or 8. And, again, the parents are not taking this as face value. They're often trying to figure out this mystery as well and trying to prove it and validate it. And like, what are they talking about? And here's a picture and who's this? That type of stuff. So, and again, before the telepathy tapes came out, I think that many of these parents were living in their own silo, thinking they were unique in this experience. So she talked to Josiah's spelling communication teacher and said, he's talking about going to heaven and seeing angels and communicating with spirits who fast. And the teacher was like, that's his special interest, go on, and the mom, Tani was thinking, this is not a special interest. This is something very big. So she writes a book to put this out there. Is there anyone else out there experiencing this? And of course, she's flooded with people saying, yes, this is our story. Well, anyway, in the very precursor of writing this book, she was working with a, kind of a ghostwriter. And she's on a call with the ghostwriter one day, and the writer, said something about another author she was working with, Max Davis. And
Josiah comes home from school later on that day, and he starts spelling something very profound about somebody. I have no clue who he's even talking about. And then all of a sudden, he uses this phrase that links back to the conversation that I was having earlier with Cheryl about this guy, Max. He writes all this stuff about Max, like he's a major novel writer. He doesn't write like other people do. He was talking about how his house was popping. And then he says, are you a barn man, Max? Like there's animals or there's a farm by you.
Well, the writer goes and tells Max, and Max is really weirded out because the things are on point. It was about what was happening in his house, like this popping noise, and he was building a house. It was about being close to animals, and like, does he live on a farm or is there a barn nearby? And it turns out that, yes, there is like a barn right next to his property with tons of animals on it.
I'm thinking this lady's loony. She's trying to get something from me. It actually made her cry because I'm a skeptic. So that's how it began.
It bothers Max because he's going, what? How does this person know this? Because they were building a new house and it was popping. They were using the nail guns.
He goes to a motel and it's like, you love your motel time or something. And he takes a nap. It's like a nap is nice.
Yeah.
And then it's something about his chapter was the fruit of something, and it was like
So the first story there was this understanding. So Tani writes it to Max. Max is totally weirded out, thinks she's on Google Chat, Google Earth looking at this. And then the next one is Josiah says, Max went into the woods and was praying last night, and that was like really freaked out Max. And then he started to believe. And then the next one was this message from Josiah when Max went to go write at this private motel on the beach on the Gulf of Mexico where he does this. He makes a mixtape and he listens to the mix and stuff. Josiah wrote something about your music is being banded together. You love your sacred time at the motel.
That's right. Yeah.
And Max by this point is like, oh my gosh. And then another time he's behind on a deadline for a book he's writing. He stays home. He takes a nap and he begged his wife to miss all the appointments for the day and to work with him. And anyway, he takes a nap. He stays up really late and he gets this entire chapter called First Fruits out.
That's right.
And then Josiah writes the next day, I hope your nap was nice. Your hands were like night braille on, something like that. Like the spirit of night braille on your fingertips kept you through the night. And you got, I hope first fruits, some things. Like he knew all the facts, and I don't have the quote in front of me, so I'm butchering what he said. But the point is, he knew about the nap. He knew about the name of the chapter.
Without Max having any communication.
No.
Yeah.
And Josiah was a pretty young, he was a boy at the time.
Yeah.
And so, no, like these things were happening privately with Max. And no one knew. And then Josiah knew. And, a beautiful part of the story that I didn't put into the podcast, just because there's the length, you have to edit some stuff. But, Max went to go visit Josiah at some point, and I think he was a little, it was a good awakening for him because Josiah, didn't want to come out of his room. He was having difficulty regulating. He was having a very hard time spelling that day. He was probably excited. But Max really had this realization of how difficult it is to control often, your body as a non-speaker.
I want to talk about John Paul, who befriends Houston, and I think is the most moving part of this whole story. He's this gentle giant. Do you want to talk about John Paul? JP?
Yeah. I mean, John Paul, he was such a presence, gigantic, 6'8". I think when I met John Paul, he was 14 or 15. And yeah, he was like a younger brother to Houston, John Paul made a lot of loud noises. He was just this big guy. He loved putting stuff on his head and dropping it off. And, it's just funny. I mean, he was, gosh. And John Paul's mother just loves him so unconditionally. And it was so beautiful to be in their home because John Paul would often strip off his clothes and just appear. And I think so many of us, when we're going through the world, are constantly apologizing for other people. And, Houston and Libby just never, just embraced John Paul. There he is, John Paul, put on your clothes. This is our house. You're just getting used to that. I loved it because it was just this unbelievable joy wrapped of I just accept him. I love him for exactly who he is. And I looked at Libby and I was like, gosh, I want, and all of these parents actually just they're such a great template of how to love your children.
Yeah.
Because so many of us don't love our kids unconditionally, but I think all these parents do in a different way than most of us can imagine. And I don't know if I should say what happens to John Paul on this because I don't know if I should. I want people to watch.
Yes. Well, which episode?
It's a 9.
9.
The kind of I would say my finale, how I concluded the story was with episode 9, and that has deeply to do with John Paul. And I think through John Paul, for me, that was proof of afterlife.
Yes.
In the most profound, beautiful way. And my dad, who was a huge skeptic walking into this, called me yesterday, and he's like, I am walking through a cemetery with a whole new take on this. He's like, I'm not feeling sad. I'm just so aware that people survive. And that was after I listened to episode 9, and I thought, wow, Dad, okay, good. If I got to you, then maybe we'll get to other people. And so I don't want to explain exactly what happens with John Paul, but it might be obvious from what I'm saying that he has quite a message for all of us at the end.
Everybody go listen to it because I was crying on a plane. I was listening to it, and it was just so profound and moving, and it'll make anybody question our conception of life and reality. And just go listen to it. So John Paul has a girlfriend, and they have this beautiful bond, and it's almost like if you watch Love on the Spectrum, that's so refreshing because it's this just there's no BS, there's no deception, no gamesmanship between these relationships. I feel like John Paul and Lily and these nonverbal kids take it to the next level where they say that their kind of telepathic bond increases their love for each other.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, can you imagine sharing everything about one another telepathically? And I remember asking Libby once because she said, they go on dates, or I'll pick them up here and they'll go on a date. And I said, well, what does that look like? And she's like, well, often they'll be on different floors of the house, but they're communicating, they're doing something, and then when they leave, John Paul will be like, that was the best day ever. and I thought that was just so sweet. I mean, he adores Lily. Lily adores John Paul. I mean, their love was real, and it was enhanced so deeply by being on the hill and being able to have mind-to-mind communication. And Lily's in the season, and she says that was from the get-go, their mind-to-mind communication.
JP, is this amazing character. He's sort of larger than life, and he's also a very, big kid who's described in the telepathy tapes. And he has a girlfriend named Lily, and he seems like this just very sweet, loving character. And he's friends with this other guy named Houston, and they all meet up on the hill. Can you talk a little bit about JP? Because I find his story to be possibly the most touching, just from a personal perspective.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, he was larger than life. I think he was like 6'8".
Mm-hmm.
And he liked, there was this game he liked to play where he loved to, like I drink a lot of water, and I had, he'd love to grab your bottle of water and put it on his head and then drop it on you. So anyway, he was a character, and he had a twin brother who, not an identical twin brother, his brother's neurotypical, and his mother is a speech language therapist.
Wow.
Who, was basically told, this is like what she's doing, what's doing with her son was like forbidden, It's like, because, the people that ASHA, the Speech Therapists Association basically says that, spelling is, an RPM, these different methods that use, pointing to letters as a, considered a form of communication that, that it's not recognized.
Why is that? It's so absurd. Why is it not recognized?
I'm the wrong person to ask. It's political. Yeah, if
a kid is able to point at letters and spell something out, why is that not seen as a valid form of communication, especially if cogent sentences are coming out on the other side of that?
It really surprised me that it really is that's controversial. And it really saddens me too.
Of course. Yeah, you're kind of putting a child back in a cage of isolation without these techniques.
Yeah. And, but yes, it's really, if you were to go to, go to the internet, look up, spelling to communicate or whatever, look at what, it says in Wikipedia or whatever, and you'll say that, something along the lines that it's pseudoscience, you'll see those kinds of remarks, that it's attacked. And so it's like, wow, if they're going to, and this is part of why I also have been doing my own thing without being as public about it, until more recently, is that it's like, if they're going to attack that even.
That's crazy. Yes.
Then, what are they going to think about the rest of all this?
Right. The actual telepathic communication. Yeah. If they're going to attack just the communication ability, I just don't understand how you can dispute something where somebody is clearly expressing things that mean something in reality and serve, certain objectives, whether it's like, I'm thirsty, get me water, or, whatever. The second that becomes like this, clearly adaptive, useful form of communication, how do you write that off? Especially when you're talking about a kid who is silenced otherwise as far as their ability to interface with the real world or with our real world. Like that, it seems inhumane.
Well, it does. And so one of the problems is that some of the people who've been the most against the idea of telepathy coming out have been people who are part of the spelling community. And so it's one of those things where you'll never, whoever it is, you'll never make progress in advocating for your rights if people are able to divide you. So anyway, so John Paul, though, good friends with Houston.
Mm-hmm.
And, and the two of them have this telepathic communication with one another. They live in Atlanta, and John Paul has a girlfriend,
mm-hmm.
Named Lily,
Mm-hmm.
and so, and seeing the love that these kids have towards their parents and that their parents have towards them is incredibly, it just touches your heart.
That's
it
amazing.
Really does. And it's coming across in the podcast. You can only imagine how it comes across in, when you've got, the whole, experience of it, not just hearing the voices.
I think, like a governor that you would place on an engine.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like a governor has been placed on reality.
Yeah.
And that's coming off.
Yeah.
And I think what you get in its place is it's almost like a Hydra situation. You cut off one head, you get 5 others, or a Cambrian explosion of ideas and possibilities. And so I think people assume that, when you get into a new paradigm or something, like one thing changes.
Mm-hmm.
But no, I mean, everything changes, and this makes total sense. I mean, it's fascinating to see how energetically sensitive these kids are, and Houston being a great example. Doesn't he go to like Stone Mountain or something as well, which he loves because of the energy there?
Yeah. And we hiked up Stone Mountain when we were in Atlanta. Even Dr. Powell came with, like we all hiked up Stone Mountain, and Houston gets to the top of Stone Mountain and it's just so free. And you can feel like he's feeling all this energy, which made me think this non-speakers center that we create maybe should go on top of a mountain, but no, he feels so much. And I think what most of the parents would say, and the non-speakers would say as well, is that it has to do with them being less tied to their body. They're less bound to the physical world than us. And so they're more open to the things that I think are natural. They're not supernatural. They're what surround us, but they have an easier access to it.
I couldn't agree more. And it's funny, in virtual reality and in lucid dreaming, which you could think of as its own sort of weird simulation, seeing your hands is this like really important test for your ability to embody in the bound simulation. And so they often feel a little disembodied, or like they're not quite, sensing their own bodies.
Yeah.
And I think the normal, conventional view is, oh, that's handicapped. But in fact, there's a filtering or a reduction going on a greater understanding when you are embodied and when you are in the simulation.
Yeah.
And so being able to dip outside of that simulation is a profound, amazing skill.
Yeah.
And if you look at the history of humanity, there's a great book called The Immortality Key by this guy, Brian Muraresku, and he talks about these mystery rituals that everybody would, undergo.
Mm-hmm.
And it's sort of the temporary paralysis of the physical body in order to, reach your primordial spirit and know that there is something more here.
Yeah.
And it feels like these kids know that in a way that is so much more like, real true knowledge, gnosis, if you will, than like the average person kind of walking around. And that brings up this book, which you were so nice to give me, and I'm just so honored to have. And this is Katie and Houston, and it's the Book of Heaven, and they signed it for me, which was so sweet of them. And it really feels like they have a conviction and metaphysics that we just relegate to mythology. We call these things sort of myths that maybe that you go to church or you go to synagogue or whatever, and you or a mosque, and you go through the motions or whatever. You don't really believe that there's something there. They know that there's something there.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would say that's true of everyone who's working in an intimate way with a non-speaker, at least that I've met. I can't obviously have a huge broad brush, but every single person I've met and hundreds and hundreds of people emailing now with their stories, is that to work intimately with a non-speaker is to be able to beautifully see the worlds they can access, the realms they can access, which me saying something like that 2 years ago would have made me laugh out loud, that I'd be on an interview talking about realms. They can access realms that we can't access.
Yeah.
They can see beings that we can't, whether, I think some will call them divine beings, some will call them light beings, some will call them angels. And certainly spirits of those who have passed. That is often as common or comes before the telepathy knowledge. And all of that stuff was, of course, paradigm shattering. Yeah. I mean, I'm a nonfiction documentary filmmaker. That was absolutely what is happening. There was like a lot of shots of whiskey along the way, lots of books. Just now I have to read and read to really understand this more. And it's real. It's real. It is happening.
Yeah.
And what's so beautiful is you can't – that's why, like, if someone now – I talk about this. I was so bashful, like I said in the beginning, talking about this. And now if I'm talking about it and someone's skeptical or doesn't believe it, I'm just kind of like, oh, you're just like a flat earther. You're stuck in the old paradigm. Bless your heart, Yeah.
Yeah.
And I really do feel that way.
Yeah.
I mean, once there's some people living right now that see how much more there is. And I love that the non-speakers, these unbelievable people who've been dismissed and marginalized and cast aside, are guides in this. And I think that's the most beautiful thing. And because their message is one of love and one of unity.
Yes.
And it's so beautiful to me because it comes back to, if we look into antiquity of a lot of our religions and faiths, and all of that comes back to love and unity. And again, like you said, you kind of just like go to church, you go to synagogue, you go to, mosque, and you're like, oh, love and love. Like how many people actually believe in love and unity or practice it in some way, and at the end of the day, that's all that I've heard the spellers want to talk about is love and unity. And even, this was really profound, and I'm still getting to grips with this. So often they'd say, it's not just your thoughts we hear, it's your feelings that we feel.
Yeah, I believe that.
And all the feelings that you put out to the world are being received and like made manifest.
Yeah.
And one speller, and this is going to be in episode 10, even said, if you don't know what your feelings are and you can't process them, like often we're doing that work for you. And that dysregulates us. I don't care what you're feeling. You need to know what you're feeling.
Yes.
Because if you know what you're feeling, you can regulate it and actualize it and calm yourself. And if you think about that, if they're hearing our thoughts, many of these non-speakers, as they say, but also feeling our feelings, I mean, of course that would dysregulate a human being.
Totally. And this so comports with, like Gabor Mate's work, or like, basically anybody would intuit as far as like a parent, kid relationship where you do immediately just absorb your parents' energy.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating to hear that explicitly articulated, because I think anybody listening will latently kind of know that. Like you are kind of embodying a lot of your earliest experiences. And you can kind of synthesize this scientifically with like the Harlow monkey test or whatever, where, if the mother isn't present and there isn't that, the necessary kind of tactile, kinesthetic, touch, that can have profoundly bad effects.
Yeah.
And so it just sounds like they're on another level of sensitivity to this. And it makes sense, right? Because our communication, it's prosaic to say that most human communication is 95% sublinguistic body language or whatever. And there's probably opportunity cost in the language itself.
Yeah.
And language allows for deception. It allows for myth making and all sorts of confusion. And if you're just cutting that out and you're going straight to the source, that feels like the true language. The final thing I'll say is there are apparently nonverbal tribes in the Amazon. Are you aware of this?
Yeah.
And they experience very similar things. And they even call it the ancient language, where they beam information to each other. And sometimes they'll have language on top of that, but they'll go back to the ancient language. And that's like the low latency, real communication.
Yeah. I mean, even in the show, the telepathy tapes, there's a young man, Asher, who was a verbal autist. He had words, and he eventually decided not to use them because they were cumbersome and difficult. And so many will say, like, we'll actually write about letters, like our obsession with using letters and like words, and they are dishonest. How many times when someone says, "How are you?" would you answer that completely dishonestly? I mean, like 80% of the time, and so it's like, if you can just, Kyle, who's a wonderful man and a non-speaker in England, at some point conveyed that, or maybe his mother did, that if you say the word, Thanksgiving or Christmas or something to someone, you say a word. But if Kyle sends that message to you telepathically, you receive the smells and the feelings and the music and the love and the family and the taste of the food and the decorations. You receive all of it. It's a knowing, like you said, a complete knowing. And when I've talked to the non-speakers about like what, I'm going through the episode 10 right now, which is what they want us to do with this knowledge. I mean, so many of them are like, if you guys could all kind of get to this telepathic place, that'd be great. It'd really evolve us. And, I think we are all capable of it because there's glimpses where we've had it, right? Where you know someone is sick and you're thinking about someone right before they call. We know it's there.
Who is Amelia?
So she's this little girl who lives in Wisconsin, whose mother contacted me, and she had taken her daughter to the the Trefford Center there, because that's where Daryl Trefford, who was, the person who was consultant on Rain Man. I mean, that's where he was, and that was his center. And so I'd take her daughter there to be evaluated because she has all of these different abilities, different, knowing different languages, knowing, and she's, in addition to being, telepathic with her mother. And she's one of the girls who said that she related to a unicorn, and she, wrote this story about how she was she called it an ugly horse, that people thought wasn't smart, and said that, that she was a unicorn.
Oh man. Then she's probably talking about her self-perception based on what other people sort of think of her, when in fact she is this beautiful, amazing unicorn.
She's this beautiful, amazing child, and yet at the time she wrote that poem, her self-esteem was affected because she perceives what other people's impressions are about her. I mean, that's the downside of being so psychic, is that you are injured even when people aren't saying anything, by virtue of them thinking things about you.
That's so amazing. Yeah, because you know their conception of you without even that needing to be articulated.
Exactly. So people can think, oh, well, I treat, people who are disabled, with respect or this or that, but they're just thinking of their outward behavior, and they don't realize that these children pick up on what you really think.
Tell us about Amelia, because I find her to be fascinating and maybe among the most conventionally regarded as just academically gifted of all of these examples.
Yeah, I mean, Amelia is little still. She's 10, and I love all these moms. So I'm going to say this about every single mom, but I love her mom, Maura, and she felt really familiar to me because, I'm from the Midwest. I only moved from Chicago to Los Angeles about 6 years ago. And, they're Midwestern, they're located in the Midwest. And her mom, Amelia's mom, works in copywriting and ad agency, and the dad's former military. They just felt like very yes, I understand you very much. You feel like my brothers and sisters and friends from high school. And, when Maura was kind of first starting to understand that Amelia was in there, again, it was related to COVID. She was at home with COVID. She saw, not with COVID, they were home during COVID, homeschooling, and she discovered that Amelia was in there and could spell, and then that she could read her mind, and then that she was seeing stuff that Maura, the mother, couldn't see. She could see spirits and ghosts, and then she started saying that she knew other languages, and she could identify hieroglyphics and knew Hebrew and Portuguese and Spanish. And
so remarkable.
Yeah.
Allie showed Amelia some Hebrew, and Amelia read it and translated it. So Allie showed her again today, and Amelia typed out what it meant. I said, but who taught you Hebrew? And she typed the rabbi. Then I asked if there was anything else she could read. She wrote hiero. I said, hieroglyphics? And she wrote, yes, pictures. So Allie pulled up a few letters, and we showed them to Amelia, and she knew what letters they were written in hieroglyphics. And they were ones that they hadn't looked up the meaning of yet. They just pulled them up and identified them after. Allie asked her if she saw these letters before, if it was the first time, and she wrote, first time. I asked her who told her about hieroglyphics, and she said, the God told.
The hieroglyphics part.
I know.
I know. That, if anything shows that there's another epistemic pathway, way of knowing, than just reading a book, the kind of inductive, it's going to take 2 years to learn baseline Spanish or whatever. Right. Amelia's the perfect example.
Yeah. Well, and one thing I love about Amelia and Maura and I mean, all the parents get this. We all understand the layers of skeptics that are going to be out there and how you need to prove it or validate it at least by having other people witness it. And what's beautiful in all these stories, many, 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 many people witness it. What I love in Amelia's case is the school, her teachers, her therapists, the principal, all witness this, all have experienced this, all know it. And it wasn't the mother, Maura, there when she was talking about hieroglyphics. It was her, I think it was her spelling therapist and her babysitter or something. I don't remember the exact people in the room right at this moment, but it was two people. And they know about the mind reading, so they were being very careful. Okay, show her a hieroglyphic image that we don't know what it is, because otherwise she'll pluck it from her mind instead of just proving that she knows it. And these are the gymnastics that the families and the teachers, and now I am also doing with the kids or I don't want to say the kids, the non-speakers, is often it's like, wait, do they know that? Or are they picking up from my mind? So you got to clear your mind or not know what you're showing them. So they did that with hieroglyphics, and sure enough, she would say what each one was, and then they'd look it up, and it was what she said it was. So how do you make sense of that unless there's more going on?
There's definitely more going on. She attributes it to the gods at times
Or
teaching
God,
her,
yeah.
or God teaching her.
Or
at
rabbi.
night.
She's talked about a rabbi coming. Wow. She's talked about God. She said an angel has taken her to see God. She said gods once or twice. In one point, I think she talked about the Dalai Lama as well. So just this beautiful, like group of traditional spiritual leaders and prophets, if you will.
I need to get into that classroom. That's the best group of teachers you could. That's amazing.
Yeah, yeah, and like I said, she's not the only one that will say those messages. And again, like the first time, Amelia said it, I mean, Maura and I, her mom and I would like be zooming and talking on the phone a lot. And we'd be like, what does that mean? Like, do you think she meant that? Or what? I mean, we're both trying to process it too.
Yeah.
And what's so beautiful about Maura is she was saying, she's like, I don't go to church that often. I didn't take Amelia to church. It's not like she's getting this from us, or the synagogue or, a Buddhist temple. It's like, where was this coming from?
Yeah. I can imagine this whole experience of the telepathy tapes coming out is cathartic for you because you probably spent a lot of your career trying to get off home plate as far as scientific consensus, even taking this seriously. And now there's just, all these different avenues you can explore as far as the implications and getting deeper as far as, causal mechanisms for how this stuff works. Whereas before it was probably just like, hey guys, this is real. Like, look over here.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
It's amazing. And I want to make something very clear as well for the audience. We're practically anonymizing these kids and families. We're just using first names. There's no 15 seconds of fame motive here.
No.
None of them have been paid, is that right?
No, of course not, no.
So it's like, and then you have, in Amelia's case, like her Spanish teacher is like, yeah, I don't know what to say. She knows more Spanish than my kids.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it's just remarkable.
Yeah.
And I do think it's important for the average listener to just know that there is no incentive whatsoever being provided for these kids. It's really about allowing their voices to be heard.
Yeah. I mean, I think the families and I have a few deeply shared goals. And I mean, I have these goals because they do, right? One is for the world to presume competence. You see a non-speaker, you can say hi to them. And it can be in your mind too. Hey, I know you're in there, like, great shoes, whatever. It doesn't matter. Just treat them as you would someone else, Presume competence. Let's validate spelling and get into schools. This is not pseudoscience. It's complicated. There's a beautiful, I think, spiritual element to it. I think that when you understand what the non-speakers are capable of, and they might dip into our neurology, or they might even use their parents' eyes, that stuff does make spelling complex and fascinating and interesting. It doesn't mean it should be disregarded. It means we have to meet the spellers where they're at and let them communicate. And I think the third is the paradigm shift, is that we are not acting as we should be as human beings. We need to be meeting each other with love and acceptance and unity, and those aren't just silly words. And I think what I have learned from them is to understand that your consciousness survives death, and our thoughts and our feelings become manifest in this world. And if we can control those things, how much will change the earth in which we're living.
We are fully audited at all times by whatever communication modality we're talking about right now. And if we were to really not just, clean up our room, make our bed, but like look inside, I think everybody would say they have work to do.
Yeah.
And I think that would make us a lot more compassionate and forgiving when it comes to other people, because everybody's got stuff they've got to work through. And it's so interesting and ironic that we call many of these kids, disabled or different than, when in fact on that dimension, which is probably the most important dimension, they're like way more advanced than all of us.
Right. No, we have the disability.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's so amazing. And it brings up all sorts of questions that you kind of discuss in episode 1 and 2 as well, as like, how is this happening? What is the method of transmission? And this is, we should caveat, all speculative. We don't know. What we do know is that this is happening in a statistically significant way. It needs to be taken seriously by science. But it's interesting. I have a good friend actually who was at the Princeton parapsychology lab.
Cool.
And he would always use the term remote perception instead of remote viewing. And I'd always be like, what are you talking about? Remote, like, why is that like a distinction at all?
Yeah.
And I do notice in both Mia and Akhil's case, they have a particular connection with one of the parents where it's almost this low latency mind meld.
Yeah.
And so, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I do. You know, because again, like, as important as the studies are for skeptics and stuff like that, the stuff that really moved me to the point of completely cracking open my paradigm was hearing what the parents would talk about. So one of the things that Manisha talked about was, look, this isn't, again, just sending information. I could be watching a movie upstairs and he could be, or downstairs, and he could be in a whole other room of the house, you know, playing on his iPad, can't hear anything. And I could come back up and he'll tell me exactly what happened in this movie. Or she said, or I could be reading a book and you read books silently to yourself. And she would ask Akhil later a question about what she just read in the book, and he could answer correctly. Like, where does this character live? And he'd write, you know, San Diego or whatever. Or she'd say, you know, I could be away at school. He'd be at school and I'd go run errands, and I'd come home, or he'd come home from school and he'd say, you know, how was Target? How was Walmart? Why didn't you get the chocolate at Trader Joe's or whatever? So he would know exactly what she did. And so that's where it becomes more than just telepathy. It's some sort of beautiful merging. And I just can't emphasize enough that for these parents who have had their hope shattered, were told that they would never connect with their child wasn't in there, beyond learning that they're in there, that they're intelligent, that the greatest gift is that their connection is so much more profound than any of us could ever imagine.
Totally.
And I think the greatest loss for so many people when they have a child with autism is this fear, will I ever have this like loving, sweet bond with my child? And
quite the contrary.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it almost feels like an extreme version or at the limit version of just a general connection that, you know, kids have with their parents often.
Yeah.
Like Rupert Sheldrake, who is very well displayed in the telepathy tapes, and who's a friend of mine and an amazing scientist. He talks about, you know, kids knowing when their parents are near, and this sort of mind meld connection occurring in statistically significant ways. I think a lot of the issue in the past with parapsychology is often the effects are weak. And so what I think is so fascinating about the telepathy tapes is you have Dr. Diane Powell saying this is often usually 90% plus hit rates.
Yeah.
That's really hard to argue with. It kind of shatters, you know, any skeptic kind of coming in. And I find that fascinating. And I think because of this, we might see a really cool kind of epistemological paradigm shift.
Yeah.
I mean, that's near term.
Been my goal the whole time, you know, is to shift the paradigm. But this is one of, I sometimes look at the paradox here as a beautiful paradox. And the paradox is that testing non-speaking individuals that have a very difficult time controlling their bodies and, you know, often are experiencing, you know, high levels of autism where you might not want to be out of your comfort zone, and it's hard to travel and noise can be tricky. And so the idea of taking a non-speaking individual and throwing him in a Faraday cage and being like, do your thing is different than someone else. And Dr. Powell and I have had so many conversations about this, which is how do we create a comfortable, loving situation to test this that is completely airtight, but where it won't be bright lights and overwhelming inputs and new inputs, where they'll feel safe and secure enough. And so when we've talked about trying to fundraise for this next phase of research that will be in the film, I was like, we got to, like, if we go to UVA, great, but like, can we put down carpets and bring in crystals and candles and sofas and things, their blankets and everything that makes them feel safe? Because it's you know, and there is, then the paradox I'm getting to is when you talk to the non-speakers, they don't get why you need the proof. This is just this beautiful gift I have. This is what this is. And why do you need your instruments to know it exists? And
Yes.
I love that, because it's like, I don't need instruments to know it exists. I don't think any of the parents or anyone in this world, the teachers, there's so many teachers and therapists. No one needs instruments. You see it because we are instruments, right? Human beings are.
Yes.
We are showing you what we can do as human beings. And I think there's this darling, again, like materialist view of like, but we must measure it and we must blah, blah, blah. And fine, I think we'll do it. And I think we're going to find the right pairs and get them in the right situation to give that proof. But I hope with this podcast, we can realize the proof is often in just the person sitting across from you, you know?
Absolutely. And I think in many ways, we were talking about this earlier, we have more to learn from them than they from us. Like they've moved on. They're in the next sort of paradigm and they're sort of bringing us along with them. And I think if we apply this materialist view of like, we must immediately instrumentalize the part we can isolate into a technology and like they are, you know, part of the instruments, that is a horrible way to look at this.
Yeah.
And so I'm totally with you. And to the extent we can get you the resources you need to build this sort of institute that maybe even as a first thing allows them to just feel heard and happy and like have a community. And then incidentally, you know, we can learn more about the world as a result. That would be a beautiful kind of goal. Just go listen to it. 'Cause
Yeah. And you know, in episode 9.2, there's a neurotypical woman who has a head injury that is able to touch the space that non-speakers can touch. And I think we see that often where there's acquired savant syndrome, right? Where someone has a horrible head injury and can suddenly play music, do math, see math everywhere, paint, sculpt. I mean, there's really unbelievable things that have happened with severe head injuries.
How can neuroscience explain that? And it reliably did it. And then there's all these other cases that are like that, where people would all of a sudden be a mathematical genius or a musical genius.
Yeah. In fact, that's part of the vector of how Dr. Diane Powell got into this, right? These savant, like people like Kim Peek and Rain Man, where clearly whatever learning is going on there belies some sort of form of cognition or consciousness that, again, is not this kind of multi-year, like inductive learning process. You're just sort of downloading vast swaths of information.
Well, it's interesting to me that often it's emotional or physical trauma that can open you up to these gifts and to these other worldly abilities. Like, let's think about that for a second. But then, as far as one thing Dr. Powell said to me early on when I was really trying to understand consciousness and how this all works, you know, and especially with the head injuries and savant skills that come with that. You know, she's like, I think of it as like if your brain is like your smartphone, right? And like every smartphone might have different apps on it. But your smartphone, it can maybe turn on, but it won't be like animated and like come to life without a signal coming from somewhere else. And that made a lot of sense to me. And you know, some people will say, well, why then if you have a head injury, won't you be able to talk anymore? You won't be able to do this. And I think it's the same thing if you think of like a piano and a piano player, right? Like to make music, like a piano needs a person. It needs a consciousness to, you know, imbue it with this beautiful, you know, artistic, you know, fervor that comes out of it. The piano has to have a piano player. The piano player has to have the piano. It's like our consciousness and our mind, or our soul. Our soul and our body.
Yeah.
It made me think that, you know, that where does information even reside? You know, when you have somebody like Kim Peek, a lot of people thought he was autistic. He actually had hydrocephalus. And so he was born with this defect in his ability to process the cerebral spinal fluid. And so there was pressure that built up in his head. And that's why he had a larger head than normal. And his head's always tilted like this because it was so heavy he could barely hold it up. And in addition to having this big area where his in the center of his brain where it's just cerebral spinal fluid, his skull bones are slightly separated from one another, but most importantly, he has no corpus callosum. And that's the bundle of fibers that connect the left and the right hemisphere. And so he was somebody who had a very, he didn't have all of the connections that we think of a brain as having. And yet here he was, somebody who could recite word for word, backwards and forwards, 12,000 books.
Yeah.
And that's just part of what he could do.
Right.
And so it's like, where does that information reside? And I thought, this model that neuroscience had doesn't make sense for memory, because it works fine for something like, some of the models within neuroscience work fine. Like, if you hit my knee, there's this knee-jerk reflex, and I can explain that, using, my understanding of how the nervous system works. Very simple. But something like memory, we're still trying to figure that out.
I'm a big fan of this transmission theory of consciousness. So like William James, Aldous Huxley, they would say the mind is probably more like a radio than like it's just like locally producing consciousness. And if you have a radio and it's playing Vivaldi's Four Seasons or something, you could take out the capacitor or the battery or mess with the antenna and it would stop playing the music. And you could say, oh, those parts, that hardware is responsible for the music. But in fact, you would have to understand, electromagnetism to know that it's tapping into a frequency that's playing this beautiful music. And I think it's the same with brain injuries where, you mess with Broca's area and speech gets shut down, or you mess with Wernicke's area and reading comprehension, whatever, occipital lobe for vision. But how that's all binding together and playing the beautiful music, the Vivaldi's Four Seasons of like everyday life is just irreducible.
Yeah.
And we're probably tapping into something.
While researching radio waves one night, I stumbled across this amazing story.
I had some dental work to be done. They put in temporary fillings.
This is beloved starlet Lucille Ball sharing a story from around the time of World War II, when she had to get several temporary fillings put in the upper and lower parts of her mouth.
All of a sudden, I heard music, and I looked down to turn off my radio, and it wasn't on. I turned around and looked to see if there's anyone behind me, and the music was getting louder and louder and louder, and I realized it was in my mouth. So the next day, I mentioned it at the studio to Buster Keaton, and he said, what street were you on, Moore Park? And I said, yes. He said, you went by the radio station. You picked it up. Well, you got any fillings? I said, yes. He said, you picked it up in your teeth.
You have these stories like, do you want to tell the Lucille Ball story? Do you know what I'm thinking of? Where...
Oh, you're talking about with her tooth?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I had a patient like that.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, they talk about it, in the telepathy tapes, but I had a patient, 25, 30 years, almost 30 years ago, who had, a filling, and she was, getting, radio signals off of it. And I already knew about that as a psychiatrist, because I was always looking for explanations for why people have these different phenomena. I already knew there was a case report about that.
Wow.
And so rather than hearing this woman say whatever, and thinking, let me give you your antipsychotic, I thought, I read about that. So, and then when she had the filling, taken out, it went away.
And that's amazing. And I think Andrija Puharich had a similar case where he found some guy who was like working in some metal sawmill or something, and a bunch of metallic ore got in his teeth, and he was hearing it's a concept called bone induction,
right?
And he was hearing things inside of his head, and he wasn't crazy. It was just literally, it points towards this transmission theory of consciousness, the fact that you're able to tap into a radio signal through your teeth, and then that somehow becomes, something you listen to. It's interesting too. I wonder if that dovetails at all with the alien abduction phenomena, because I was just with an experiencer named Mario Woods who was at Ellsworth Air Force Base in South Dakota, which is a nuclear base. And, he had a Q clearance, and he was guarding these ICBMs, and, it was a pretty serious, hardcore job. And he got abducted by aliens, and he was checked by a medical doctor afterwards, and they checked his teeth. So that always kind of struck me as like, I don't know, is there something going on there? What do you make of Andrija Puharich and his program in upstate New York, where he took all these kids who seemed to have high telepathic psi powers, and they would just channel, and they would talk about the nine, and they would say all sorts of really interesting ontological, cosmological things about how the universe works. And it's hard to say, whether any of this stuff was true. But I mean, I think your research should at least make us relook at that research and say, maybe there was some truth to that. And where do you think, that research went? Because Puharich is this odd character. He was at Northwestern, and he was kind of tied in with, MK Ultra, CIA brainwashing stuff. And so, yeah, I guess where do you think that all went? Because there seems to be this big gap between that and now we're experiencing this resurgence. And I think you have very different intentions than he did, and then the people around him did. But yeah, what do you make of all that research?
Oh, I'd like to, know more about it. I mean, in the sense that, I've looked into some of this stuff, but a lot of it, who knows it, wasn't he funded at least in part by the CIA?
Yes, he was.
Yeah. And so, I don't think that it's accessible, information. Yeah. I've heard him talk about things like scalar waves.
Yeah.
And
extremely low frequency.
Yeah.
Are you familiar with the scalar physics and stuff?
Yeah.
Okay. What do you think about that?
I think it's a very interesting idea, and there's a physicist in Germany who calls himself, I think it's Konstantin Mile.
Yes.
Yeah, who calls himself the modern Tesla, you know, and I've looked into his stuff. And
what do you think of his stuff? I'm fascinated by this. Yeah. Wait, a little context for the audience. So scalar physics is this idea that if you actually more faithfully adhere to the original 21 Maxwell's equations and in kind of classical electrodynamics, not the condensed vector calculus equations of Oliver Heaviside, who followed up after Maxwell, that allows for the existence of this new scalar field where you can get electric and magnetic potentials, where you can get scalar and vector potentials without traditional magnetic and electric fields present. And in this scalar field, you get all sorts of exotic wave types outside of your normal transverse Hertzian wave. And one of the wave types is called helicoidal waves. And that seems to match up with, double helical DNA. And so Konstantin Mile is studying these sort of scalar waves in the context of botany and stuff, where he'll make flowers grow in beautiful ways using these scalar longitudinal helicoidal waves. I'm fascinated by it.
We're going to have to schedule another time to talk. We're going to have to go. I think you and I could talk for a long time about a lot of things.
Yeah, we definitely could. Yeah,
we could definitely talk about it. Yeah, but I really think that it makes sense to me that scalar waves could be involved, and there's more than one instance, where you have in physics.
Yes.
And this is the kind of thing my brother and I, who's a physicist, have talked about a lot, and other friends of mine who are physicists, where what they do is they treat something as though it's null. They treat it as though it doesn't exist because it simplifies their formula. Mm-hmm. And, and the main thing that they're looking at, it works okay. Mm-hmm. Okay, so it works okay to just treat it as though it's zero, and they just drop it off. Okay, and I think that one of those things is the scalar wave component of electromagnetism. Yeah, and the original equations were. There were far more of them, there was far more complexity there. And it's just we don't need this, we don't need that, we'll just give you this,
It's amazing.
And a similar thing for, the experiment that was proposed to prove that ether didn't exist.
Yes.
And
Michelson-Morley experiment.
Yes.
In 1890.
Yes. And Beverly Rubik, who's a biophysicist, and Harry Jabs, who's a physicist, they looked at that data and they wrote a paper basically saying, well, wait a minute. There actually was an effect. And how large of an effect were you expecting? And this is actually in the magnitude that we would expect. So it's some effect, there is an effect.
Yes. And it's also the absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence. So even if there wasn't an effect, you can't definitively disprove the ether. And then if you read in this, I think it's 1921 or 2 paper, special relativity was supposed to negate the ether. And then Einstein writes later in his career, he says, actually, general relativity is totally compatible with an ether. And then if you look at quantum electrodynamics, which is really the tip of the spear of like modern science, with Feynman and stuff, we have vacuum energy. You have energy everywhere. So it's like the ether is back.
Yes, it is. It sure is. The ether is back. And I think scalar waves are making a comeback too.
I think so as well.
Yeah. So I think it's an exciting time for science.
Yes.
Because it's like we're rediscovering what had been discovered, but we're now ready to actually, move forward with it.
I agree. And I think Tesla discovered it. I think another guy named Thomas Townsend Brown discovered it. And I think it often involves kind of high voltages across short distances. And when I speak to some pretty deep government people, they often say, there's a there when it comes to extended electrodynamics. There's a guy named Lee Hively who publishes on it. There's an anonymous Navy scientist that showed up in one of my documentaries that talks about extended electrodynamics. And it's just this thing that continuously comes back. And I initially cataloged it as, low probability and maybe hard to detect. But I'm learning more and more about it, and from very credible people, to the point where I somewhat high conviction that there's something there. And yeah, to your point about the equations, the Lorentz equation, the vector and scalar potentials were just set to zero out of pure expediency. And then you have things like the Bohm-Aronoff effect, where it seems like there, even without a magnetic field present, there are potentials present. And so this is sort of explained away by the electromagnetic force potential, but that's a very poor explanation. And I think not only is the jury still out, I think it's going to move towards this extended model very, very soon. And I'm excited about it. I mean, there are obviously maybe dangerous dual use implications, but hopefully it unlocks, really good stuff as well. Do you know the caudate nucleus and putamen?
I know about that. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That's a part of the brain that I find fascinating, because a friend of mine named Gary Nolan at Stanford, who's a microbiologist, he studies this area of the brain. The more neuronally dense it is, the more kind of executive functioning somebody seems to display. But by executive functioning, it's really just kind of what we would call psychic intuition. Mm-hmm. And in fact, I think there's, a study where you hook up somebody's brain to an fMRI and they're playing the game of Go. And when they make a quote unquote brilliant move, which is a move that doesn't make any sense in the context of, the game and where it's at, but it makes sense in the context of an endpoint that they almost have to psychically know about, that part of the brain lights up. And apparently when a person takes iboga, that part of the brain lights up, which, people seem to get, have these sort of visionary experiences. This is this kind of psychedelic African tree bark that's been ingested for thousands of years. And so, I wonder if that part of the brain is somehow part and parcel to this different epistemological pathway that is immediate download based or something.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
Yeah, well, it'll be interesting to see. I mean, as I said, I really think that the ventricles and the cilia that line them, the cilia containing cells that line them, are huge, a huge component of this whole mind. Okay, but what you also need to know, most people won't know this because they don't know neuroanatomy, is that the caudate and the putamen are real close to the ventricles. Okay, so imagine it as being that, this is, like the sensory section, and the caudate and the putamen are then the processors of that sensory. You see what I'm saying? It's like...
it's right next to the receptors.
Yes.
Yeah. So it's like kind of the first encoder of the information.
Exactly.
That's amazing.
Yeah, that's my own theory. Nobody else has said that.
All right.
You caught it.
You heard it here first.
Yeah.
That's really exciting. Yeah, we should be studying that more. I mean, I'd be curious because you can literally do MRIs on people that seem to have more paranormal experiences, seem to be more quote unquote psychic or have predictive accuracy in these sort of controlled experiments. And they're more neuronally dense in that area. And it runs through families and seems to be hereditary. And so I wonder if some of these kids took these MRIs, if they would have more neuronally dense caudate nucleuses and putamens.
Yeah, well, we do know that there definitely are studies that show differences in the caudates of autistics.
Interesting. Okay, so you already know that. I didn't realize that. That's amazing.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah, and the same thing for people who are schizophrenic, and so that, a lot of what we label schizophrenic, might be, something else. Because I know that that's kind of the training of psychiatrists, is to label somebody as schizophrenic if they report a lot of these phenomena.
Yeah, I don't really believe in the DSM.
Oh, I don't either.
Yeah, you just put somebody in a box and you slap a label on the thing, and it sort of creates this learned helplessness of like, okay, now treat it biochemically with a thing, instead of like, what does that mean? Why do you have that? And could it be adaptive in certain ways? And then could it also be, could you overcome it in other ways? And it's way more pliable than just like this, you have this thing, like, go away, you're not normal.
Yeah, I just always found, the DSM, is really primarily a tool that is used by attorneys and health insurance companies for their purposes. Health insurance companies use it as a tool to say, okay, for that diagnosis, what treatments are we going to authorize that someone can have? And for lawyers, it's, for those diagnoses, what kind of, punitive, compensatory damages can we, ask for? Yeah, so it's strictly a, created as a description. It's not a description of the truth. No. It's a description of clinical syndromes that it's changed like 3 times in my career.
Yeah.
It's a description of them that then is used for those purposes, but we shouldn't be locked into it as thinking that it's describing reality.
And it's symptomatic, superficial. It's often like behavioral superficial. Maybe one step better is it's superficial, but it's like a thing the body seems to be like, it's like you could say a fever, right? But then you're slapping, you're saying this person has this disease or this issue or whatever, but like a million things could cause a fever, And so like even the biological stuff is completely overdetermined. And you need to actually splice out what are the underlying causal factors of this stuff. And so, yeah, I hope we end up with a new model that's better.
Absolutely. And that was, where I trained at Johns Hopkins, we were taught to really look for various different causes of a syndrome. We knew it was a syndrome and that could have multiple different causes. And so we would look for it. Well, a lot of syndromes have a biological cause, as in if you treat their, they've got too much calcium, okay? If you treat their hypercalcemia, okay, then XYZ symptoms go away.
Right.
Okay? Or hyperthyroidism or hypothyroid. There's a number of conditions that are caused by medical things. So that's why we train in medicine first, and to look for those. Sometimes it's, psychosocial. Okay. So we want to have a good psychosocial history and understand psychology, understand sociology. Maybe that's the problem. Maybe it's a really, family dynamics are a problem. Sometimes, it's, that you'll hear somebody say something and it's really a spiritual crisis for them.
Yeah.
Okay. Because, and maybe they've experienced some devastating, experience. Yeah. And so what I discovered though early on is that because I was taking histories from people and trying to think, asking them about everything from their physical well-being to, their, what kind of thoughts they had, what kind of, feelings they had, et cetera. I would listen to their stories and try to think of, okay, where's the intervention going to be? Is it that I need to intervene in terms of, a medical condition or, refer them for psychotherapy or do psychotherapy myself? And I'd listen to these stories, and some of the stories that were the wildest stories that you would think, oh my gosh, I'd later find out were true. And so sometimes, the thing that you think, oh, well, maybe this is a sign of psychosis or somebody who's, a pathological liar or whatever,
Yes.
you go, no, there's actually another possibility, and that is that this is the truth. And it's just that you yourself have not ever experienced anything like it, but it doesn't mean that it's not
totally
the truth.
Hopefully by enabling these kids with these communication methods, we could allow them to come out more. Do you feel like they want us to know their abilities? Because that almost feels like a part of your mission is letting the world know that these are not only humans, they're extraordinary humans. And do you feel like they also have this drive to be known?
For sure. I mean, I would not be doing this if it wasn't for that, you know? And I think deeply, I think they want us to know ourselves as much as they want us to know and appreciate and see them and to validate them. But it's been lovely or validating for me to hear how many non-speakers are so excited about the telepathy tapes. I'll get little text messages of parents showing me them listening over and over and, feeling for the first time maybe by some seen, validated, heard. And not often their parents know, but now the parents have a way to say, I'm sending this to Aunt Judy, I'm saying this to Grandpa, and maybe he'll believe me now. So I think the fact that in their own circles, they're getting the respect that they deserve, finally.
Yes.
The validation that what they're talking about is absolutely real, absolutely critical to all of us, And from every speller that I've had contact with, they're very, very excited and I think have foreseen this time as being a part of where we're all headed. And I think they would say that this is all part of a I mean, there's many parts of it, but a step forward in our own human evolution to get back to who we really are.
How can we better tap into this paradigm individually, just ourselves? Because I don't know, there's like the, intellectual version of it where which one of the kids like puts on a hat and like downloads like F. Scott Fitzgerald novels? That's Houston.
Yeah.
It's so remarkable. So there's like that, there's that element, and then there's just the love and unity element, which is probably most important.
Yeah.
How do we effectively, listen to the telepathy tapes and come away with the right takeaways and operationalize this in our own lives?
Yeah, I mean, the work of Julia Mossbridge, and I think she'll talk about love being like essential to psi abilities. And,
it is.
Yeah, and it is. And I think part of the unconditional love you see from the parents to their non-speaking children, and teachers to their non-speaking students, but also from the non-speakers to these individuals being so often, hopefully, being patient and giving and loving and sacrificing to try to take care of them, in a very difficult body often. And that is a situation surrounded with love and sacrifice. And it is within that situation where these beautiful things, these beautiful gifts manifest most easily. And even if you think about your own life, right, where you might have had a moment of seeing a loved one right before they passed, or knowing something is like really wrong with someone that you care for, it's because you love them usually, right? And it's usually in a moment of like fear for them or their life or their well-being. So I think a lot of these things come back to love. But we know it's part of us because the Vikings talked about it, like old Celtics did, the Native Americans did. I mean, all of this stuff is part and parcel of being a human being. I think our reliance on language and our cloudiness around materialism, having for the past, 300-400 years believed that the only things that are real are what you can measure and observe, that has harmed us. It's taken us away from who we are, because I think if you were to go back in time and ask people about telepathy, it wouldn't be like you need to go prove that. That's just part of the human experience. It would just be like asking someone to go prove love. Well, how do you do that,
Right.
And I think about Dr. Ian Stevenson from the University of Virginia, he was studying past lives in children. And when he went to India and he was like, I'm trying to prove, past lives, they're like, well, why are you trying to prove that? We already know it's real, And so I think that's, I'm not making a comment on reincarnation. I'm just saying, like, I think that's the same idea, is that we're trying to prove something that is just part of our being. It's not
just part of our
paranormal. It's
being.
normal.
It's just super normal. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's so interesting. Yeah. It's like with the whole UFO disclosure conversation. You go to South America or something and they're like, yeah, we talk to star people all the time. We have, rituals that involve them. But it's like, but we're going to be the one, our government is going to disclose this. There's going to be a file and we're going to sort of let it out. And that same friend I mentioned prior who, studied at the Princeton Parapsychology Lab for decades, who I just, in my mind, beyond reproach, just a really good person and beyond rigorous as well. And one of the smartest people I know, would say that, you take these random event generators. That was his like staple experiment. And so you're tying, this 1-0 output to something that's, conventionally thought of as random in quantum mechanics.
Yeah.
So, radioactive isotope decay or something like that, which with a known statistical distribution over a long enough time scale, you expect there to be the same amount of ones and zeros because it's a perfect digital coin flip, within a standard deviation. And there's a real effect that your mind can have on the output. And the dirty little secret that he's like, this is well known in REG, random event generator circles, is that your heart-centeredness is somehow commensurate with your ability to affect the output on the random event generator. And so, if that isn't like a new religious movement, I don't know what is. It's really this amazing thing where it's like, your mandate is to go within, and if there are any kind of impure intentions to fix that, because that is literally your it's also your kind of ability to render the material world in a way. It's so interesting.
And I don't know if I talked about this in the series or not, but for the teachers who were able to build a two-way telepathic link with their students, which is a phenomenon in and of itself, teachers hearing their students back. So two-way telepathy. I mean, right there, that proves that we can do this. And again, I don't know if the non-speakers just being in that loving, supportive space with them helps turn it on or what. But for a lot of these cases, the students often, their first words will be tune into my heart. That's the first thing ASHA said to Jess, was tune into my heart. And I love that. It's not saying think about my heart, it's saying tune. Think of that frequency, tune into my heart. And so, I don't have a rule book or manual on how to do that. But I just think if you sit there and think about someone you love and concentrate on what you're grateful for and that person and how your life has changed because of that person and what they represent, you can feel someone even if they're not speaking to you, right?
I think it's good there's no rule book. I think it's good that you have to audit what's going inside of you. And it's this kind of messy thing that really involves your personal growth and evolution as a person. And it's funny in the UFO world, a lot of people are like, well, what do you know or whatever, and it's not like it's like I think it's an awareness. And I think these kids are on a whole other level with their awareness. It's not like a file you can give somebody. It's not this semantic body of information. And that comes through auditing the self and through personal growth. And that's, something you can't short circuit.
No. I'm smiling because I just thought about something that, too, in terms of this tuning into something, you also have to give yourself space to validate that maybe an idea or a thought or an image isn't coming from your own mind. And that had never occurred to me until 3 nights ago. Think about this. I've been working on this for almost 4 years. 3 nights ago, I woke up with this extreme vision of something that had to be in the film. And it had to do with finding a real metaphorical hill and bringing as many non-speakers there together and making it beautiful and a really spiritual place. And Houston was very prominent in this dream. And so I woke up in the morning and I wrote Katie and I said, does Houston send me images at night about the movie? Can you ask him if he just did that? And she wrote back and she asked Houston, and Houston said, yes, I do send Ky images. And here I was thinking, I'm having this idea about the film. Maybe it wasn't my idea. Maybe it was Houston's idea. I think it probably was. And he was trying to convey something to me.
Oh, wow.
And I didn't, for so long, I've just been taking it as, okay, here's this idea I had in the middle of the night when, you're the most open to this stuff.
Yes.
And that, again, was shifted my paradigm entirely because I thought, oh my goodness, has this been happening all along? And how many parents is that happening to? Well, non-speakers are wonderful individuals with beautiful personalities and these incredible capabilities, but they do require help and care and sacrifice from those around them. And it's often a 24-hour 7 sacrifice, an act of love. And so, so I think if there's anything that comes out of this, I really hope people start to just help the parents, give them the resources they need. And that will help the non-speakers very much as well, but also giving the non-speakers resources and help and friendship. Like I loved going to a bar with Houston, and Houston just had a beer.
Yeah.
You know, we were all sitting at the table, and Dr. Powell was there and Dr. Jeff Tarrant. Like this was one of the nights we were filming, and Houston just had his like Budweiser and was like, you know, typing along. And I remember thinking at the table, I wish I lived in Atlanta and I could do this all the time with Houston. Like I love watching football or whatever. And yes, I mean, just like all of us, you want a loving relationship, you want friends. I hope people aren't afraid to befriend non-speakers. It will take more care and sacrifice and time, but you can have a very fruitful, beautiful relationship.
Yes.
And so that's what I hope. I hope their lives become so much more expansive with community and love and friendship.
I love that. I think that is going to happen. And how can we effectively steer it in that direction?
Well, I was thinking about this a lot because one of the things Katie talked about, which broke my heart, was how for so many parents with non-speakers who have a hard time controlling their body and might be stimming and making noises, how hard it was just to even go out in social situations, to go to a bar, to be on an airplane, to go to a movie. Because the way she said it was, you know, we're always worried about affecting like the normal people and, you know, or their children being afraid of my child. And so we have to go. And how socially isolating that can be. Katie, who's an evangelical Christian and, you know, her faith means everything to her, said it was hard to go to church. Even at church, they'd be like, oh, make him go quiet. Like, you know, can he just go to this room instead? And like, how awful, right? So I think the first thing we can do is just have some like grace and compassion and welcome non-speakers into our spaces. And I said this in an interview recently, and I'm sure maybe it sounded trite and silly, but I actually meant it, is like, if you own a bar, if you have a restaurant, like have a night where it's like non-speakers welcome, like, you know, like autism night, like come and hang out, and allies too, friends too, you know, at a skating rink. I mean, I don't know, whatever small business you have, whatever it is, at the elementary school where my kids go, you know, myself and a few other parents have made it really an effort at every event to have a safe room for people on the spectrum or with sensitivities where they can go and be part of this event, but not be bombarded by what might feel uncomfortable. So we can all do something in our own world to make society easier for non-speakers and their families to go out and participate in. Right there would be huge.
I totally agree. And I hope that is a call to action that is heard widely. And I think it's in the best interest of these people to open up as well, because we have so much to learn.
Yeah.
And so, I hope you know,
well,
be on the forefront of this.
Yeah. And like, I thought about this the other night, just one point is like, most of my non-speaking friends and relationships are scattered around the country. And I was thinking the other day, I'm like, I wish I knew at least, you know, a few non-speakers in Burbank where I live. Yeah. So I could go walk in Griffith Park with them once a week, give the parent a break, you know, just come on and swim in my pool. I know you love water, you know, like come, like let's hang out and chill, because even in everyday life, I have the people I'm talking to all over the country every day, but not the person right in my midst that I just want to go hike with and walk around the block with and hold their hand and say, we got you, you know, and like, that break for the mom is so huge, or the dad. Yeah. And also so good for the spellers to get out with other people, and so good for all of us. Yeah. I mean, it's a beautiful community of individuals that I hope more people get to know and love and appreciate.
I hope so too. I think they have so much to teach us. Have you ever read the book Childhood's End by any chance, by Arthur C. Clarke?
No.
It's very interesting because kids start to develop telepathic, clairvoyant powers. It talks about this sort of like non-human intelligence that is kind of this mental sheath all over the world. Yeah. Who knows if that part is, you know, true. But the bridge to this sort of, you know, other world are these kids that start to develop this clairvoyant power.
and they're kind of the ambassadors for humanity.
Oh, wow.
And I just,
Yeah,
so I find that so, and Arthur C. Clarke's this very interesting character to me, where he's like, there's something about that guy and Stanley Kubrick and some of these other guys where it's like you're tapped into some sort of like, you're imagining some pre-reality that is going to kind of manifest.
Yeah.
So,
well, I think one thing I've learned is from what a lot of the non-speakers will say is that what we create on Earth really matters.
It's a total,
And those creative ideas are coming to us often from somewhere else. And so once I started getting into this world, reading fiction in a whole new way and often being like, whoa, like wherever this is coming from might be an insight or a key into our greater reality. And all this stuff is being funneled through creators and writers. And I love that.
Yes, I think that's the case.
Yeah.
And on the scientific front, Dr. Diane Powell's medical license was revoked. Is that right?
Yeah.
How do we make sure that her and people like her are protected, especially when they, like her, have the best of intentions? And I think similar to you, empowering these kids so they can study this stuff and, teach it to the rest of us and even bring it into our scientific paradigm.
What happened to Dr. Powell was awful. When she wrote her book, The ESP Enigma, she had her medical license revoked because she was talking about ESP, and she had to go through psychological testing to get her license back.
So demeaning. It's ridiculous.
When they read the book, they realized it was extremely sound science, of course. I mean, she's a brilliant, scientist and researcher. And then she was fine, not only in the state where she was practicing, Oregon, she was fine in California where she wasn't even practicing, but she, I think she had a medical license there. And it traumatized her. She'll say that it traumatized her. Yeah. And of course, like you don't want to have income taken away from you. You don't want to have, I can't imagine if I made a documentary and someone slapped me with fines.
Right.
What?
Yeah.
And it shouldn't be happening to scientists either. And Dr. Rupert Sheldrake certainly talks about this. Like scientists should have a freedom of inquiry, just like journalists, just like creators should. By asking a question or presenting a hypothesis, you shouldn't be fined and intimidated and have your credentials revoked and tainted. And I don't know how to fix that. I just hope awareness will. I hope even just this podcast going out there kind of lets people think for themselves when they see that a scientist has had their name tainted. That like, is that a materialist paradigm, which is this belief that like everything has to be measured and, it's all like concrete what we understand and see? Is this a materialist paradigm that's keeping these scientists in check? Did they really do anything wrong? So we all just need to start asking that question.
Yeah, and we also have to ask, to the materialists out there, if this is all quackery, why revoke her license? Why are you threatened at all? Mm-hmm. Let her continue to do her studies. They're not going anywhere because it's all fake or whatever. Right. So it shows an insecurity. The fact that you have to censor, means there's maybe even a part of you that thinks that this is real.
Right.
And it's funny. I was just with her. I didn't realize this. She's such a fascinating person. She has this kind of analogous life with John Mack, like where she was friends with John Mack, who was at Harvard. Similar situation where a traditionally kind of pedigreed guy, head of the Harvard psychiatry department, very serious background. And towards the end of his life starts to study all of these people who are earnestly coming to him saying, we've had all these, alien abduction experiences.
Yeah.
And he was persecuted by Harvard. There was a trial there.
Yeah.
And so he dies. He gets hit by a car very tragically in London. And she goes to his memorial. And I guess all the people at my memorial are like, Dr. Powell, you have to take on Dr. John Mack's legacy. This is really important. And I think she ends up running his institute. I think it's called GEM or something. Mm. And then she buys this house, which serendipitously like kind of comes into view for her in Oregon. And the house's birth date when it was built was the same birthday as John Mack or something. And so it's this very interesting kind of synchronicity.
Gosh, I'm so like just in awe right now that you're bringing this up, because on the car ride over here, I was talking to my producer, Jen, and she said, she was talking about the UFO, just like the world, how often it's interviews and it's a lot of the science and everyone's looking at the science and the experiencers and not experience, the disclosure and the technology and XYZ. And I said, I didn't really understand the whole world until I read John Mack's book, and I understood what all these experiences were talking about. And it made my heart and my body like ache and hurt and swell and confused. And I bought in. Then I was like awakened to it because I understood what people were experiencing.
Yes.
You know, and anyway, we were talking about that in a way here, that like the gifts of like John Mack bringing these experiences, not just, you don't have to, I mean, I can't speak for everyone. From my point of view, you don't have to prove everything with instruments and data.
Yes.
And look at these hundreds of people having the same experience all over the world. That's what John Mack did.
Yes.
For ufology, I think.
Oh, he totally did. And he's, I think, a part of this paradigm shift because there's this amazing conversation he had with Terence McKenna, who's also one of these paradigm shifters. He's sort of I call him a fungal philosopher, you know, really interested in mushrooms and, you know, new paradigms in consciousness, and just an amazing guy. And he and John Mack are speaking, and John Mack, you know, McKenna is actually playing the role of this kind of like funny provocateur where he's asking these questions to Mack, but they're kind of leading questions that he knows the answer to, and you can see it on his face. And he's like, you know, what's going to happen to the Western paradigm or something? And John Mack says, oh, it's going to burst open, and we're all going to realize that the Western paradigm is incredibly myopic and closed.
If you want to shatter the Western mental structures, the Western mind, so to speak, which is now permeating the whole earth in its materialist, dualistic philosophy, the way you do it is you take something that's supposed to be in the spirit world, because even in the West we can make allowance for the spirit world, and we can study it through mythology, through religion, through imagination, through poetry. But the one unforgivable sin to the Western mind is when something that should be in the spirit world transgresses and shows up in the physical world.
And I think what he's getting at is this idea that the observer-observed dichotomy is going to break down. This idea that there's an impartiality, this distance between me as this like perfect instrument of observation and what I'm seeing is going to collapse.
Yeah.
And these kids are just the perfect example of that, where they can sense people's energies in this sort of just extremely precocious way, and what you're feeling matters. And that really, I mean, the name of my show is American Alchemy as well, and that the alchemical process is changing the outer world through the inner. And I wonder if we're at the end of this. You know, John Mack was friends with Thomas Kuhn, who you know, wrote The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, and he was like, you got to look into this, because Thomas Kuhn knew that you know, at the end of a paradigm shift, or sorry, at the end of a current paradigm, you have a law of marginal returns, declining marginal returns, where you're just, you know, kind of dotting the I and crossing the T on like your final theory, and then it all just kind of blows up. And you see it happening right now with string theory and physics, where you have people like Leonard Susskind, the top of the field, who are getting interviewed, and they're like, oh, we haven't really discovered much. Like I give ourselves, you know, B+ or whatever. Yeah. And then you have all of this stuff that's coming out, and it's like kind of undeniable.
Yeah.
And academia, I think, is going to be laid bare as kind of playing catch up on this stuff, because they have to play these reputational optics games.
Yeah.
I see it with high profile friends of mine who are like in academia. They have like more of a reputation. I'm like this ragtag former VC or whatever. I'm like, this is real, like so obvious. And they're like, okay, like send me the paper and I'll read it. And they're like, well, if the New York Times reports on it, then I'll take it seriously.
Right.
I was like, just look at the data. What's you know, think for yourself.
Think for yourself, for sure. And that's what I would say to anyone listening who's just like, I don't know what to believe, I don't know what to make of this. Approach everything with open-minded skepticism. Because if you're just a closed-minded skeptic, you're dogmatic. You're just like a fundamental religious person who won't listen to anything else, or you might be exactly what you are against in a lot of ways. And being an open-hearted skeptic doesn't mean you don't ask questions. It doesn't mean you don't explore the truth, but you need to be open that the truth might be very different than what you think it is. And I think that's what I encourage people to do. Be open-minded skeptics, and your world will be blown.
I love it. How can we help you, and how can we help these kids?
You know, I'm in the process of raising money for the film, and I'm having some wonderful conversations, and I'm hoping we'll have funding together, you know, by next year. I mean, that's my goal. And so, you know, I will keep people up to date on that. I would honestly say the best thing people can do right now is just share the telepathy tapes with their friends and family and teachers, and And just to help with this paradigm shift, all I want is for people to hear this message. And as far as the non-speakers go, advocate for spelling, write to ASHA, talk to your school district, write a letter. ABA therapy is not the solution. I think every parent will say that. I mean, spelling has been a miracle worker. We have to get spelling into schools ASAP and universities.
Well, this has been an absolute honor, Dr. Powell, and I hope that everybody understands how earnest and rigorous you are in your work. And I think it's an absolute atrocity that your medical license was revoked at one point, right?
Yeah.
Just for looking into this stuff.
Yeah.
And so, thank you for giving us your time, and excited to make something cool out of this.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Go listen to the telepathy tapes, and let's destigmatize spelling immediately and allow these kids to get heard. And let's get you some no strings attached money for whatever you want to do creatively around this in the future. And thank you, Ky. This was amazing.
Thank you so much for having me. What a great combo.
Yeah.
Thank you so much to MyHeritage for sponsoring this video. Please check out their 14-day free trial via the link in the description or the QR code.